All right, so the topic we're going to discuss today, and it's going to come in the form of going through the story that I found in the Columbus Dispatch. This topic is the one where people are saying that police officers should be replaced with social workers. And then if you give them any pushback on that, they'll say, okay, well, how about we send a social worker with a police officer on calls that are involving somebody who is in mental health crisis? That's a great idea. Well, it would just so turn out that the city of Columbus had one of those programs, and the program is going through some dramatic changes right now. The reason it's going through some changes is because the officers and the city had some serious problems with the organization who was providing the clinicians. Now, the funny thing about this program and this rift that started is that the police officers and the clinicians actually got along great. They got along so well that the clinicians are actually leaving their mental health care provider and coming to work for the city because they like the way that the city and the police officers kind of handled these calls, and they had a really strong relationship and a good understanding, more so than the clinicians had with their own supervisors. So this is one of those, this is actually a story about how this whole anti-police narrative can really spoil some things that are going really well. It's a bit ironic that a story would fit that narrative so well, because it's something that I have been saying for a really long time, and I know that I'm not the only one who's been saying this. So the headline reads, Columbus is hiring its own 911 mental health crisis response workers after Netcare deal sours. This was written by Columbus Dispatch reporter Bethany Bruner. It was published on the Sunday edition, I believe, and it's a subscriber only thing. So you're getting a little preview to what you can generally only get if you're a paid subscriber. I'm not going to read the whole top of the program because I basically just described that to you. For the last 2 years, the city of Columbus and the police department has had a program where mental health clinicians are actually paired up with police officers and they ride along together. And that program worked really well. And then we get down here about halfway through the article. She said, but multiple sources have told the Dispatch that the relationship between Netcare and the police division became so frayed that the city ended its contract with Netcare at year's end. This was at the end of the year 2021. The city has begun hiring its own mental health clinicians and social service personnel through Columbus Public Health. Now, we're going to get down to another part of the article here in a moment, where you're going to hear from a clinician who used to work for Netcare, and he said that the environment became so toxic that clinicians began to leave that organization and go find jobs elsewhere. Well, you have a line here that says the city has begun hiring its own mental health clinicians and social service personnel. I don't think you need to have a master's degree or a PhD to determine where the city is going to hire these people from. Basically, what these clinicians are doing is they're jumping ship from Netcare because they don't think Netcare is a quality organization, and they're coming to work for the city because they like the way the police officers are handling their business. And I think that's a very important point to make, and it's something that these people who don't think police officers are qualified and know what they're doing, this is something that they need to understand. So this part of the article here, this is a bunch of public relations garbage. This is public relations from Netcare. It's a little bit of city council talking about just political speak. This is the meat and potatoes of the article that I really want to get into and share with you guys. This guy named Phil McGeorge, he was a clinician with Netcare, and he was one of the guys who would go out on these teams and go out into out in the field with the officers and deal with people in their homes or wherever they were in public that were going through a mental health crisis. So his opinion in this scenario is probably the most important as far as I'm concerned. So let's get into what he had to say. So it said, Phil McGeorge worked as a clinician with Netcare with the MCR units for 2 years until the end of 2021. He confirmed that the program began well and had the support from both police and supervisors with Netcare. But the situation changed when a new supervisor with a nonprofit was appointed to oversee the clinicians. So there was a leadership change at Netcare. We had some stressors coming from Netcare where they wanted to control and second guess the clinicians. When we would go to the call, we were having to call back in and having our judgment second guessed. It got to a point where we felt like, what were we doing if we had to call in every time we go on a response? That's why I got my license to make these decisions. So he's talking about how they didn't appreciate being micromanaged. In the early part of 2021, McGeorge said the new supervisor and communication issues began creating a work environment that led to clinicians leaving the program. That was kind of what I talked about a moment ago. He's saying that this supervisor and the way they handled their business was making these clinicians, these professionals with their license, they didn't want to work for that company anymore. And he said they had placed a person who was verbally very blatant about how she didn't like police officers, and she was in control of a program where clinicians worked with police officers. So what Netcare did was they basically hired an anti-police activist or promoted an anti-police activist and put them in charge of a program where clinicians worked very closely with police officers. And does that surprise anybody that didn't end well? It ended in a situation where the city decided to cut ties with Netcare altogether, which is a catastrophe for some people that really needed those programs. As the months went on, it became more and more micromanaged and more condescending. It got to the point where she was questioning everything we were doing. McGeorge, who is now retired, also said Netcare personnel would not communicate with Columbus police supervisors about things such as scheduling, and one clinician was formally reprimanded for attending crisis intervention training with officers. It's kind of silly. Let's see. The city is currently in the process of hiring more clinicians and social workers for their right response unit, help to create an alternative response to certain types of 911 calls. So if do you even have to read between the lines to understand what they're saying? I've already mentioned it a couple of times. These clinicians that are highly qualified people are leaving so they can come work for the city, and it's not under the police department, but their job is going to be working with the police department. Let's see. Oh, and then there's some more BS about how they look to grow the MCR program through Columbus Public Health and instead of using outside sources and all that kind of stuff. Oh, and then down here, she actually spoke to an officer. So let's get the perspective of an officer. One officer who worked with the MCR unit told the dispatch that supervisors wanted officers and their clinician partners to be doing clinical work in the field rather than responding to patients in crisis. These are two very different words. Clinical and crisis. We don't do follow-up. We deal with people in crisis. So the whole point of this program is that we had people calling 911 for mental health services, and we needed this officer-clinician tandem to be able to respond to these 911 crisis calls. And one of the things that Netcare started to do was say, hey, we now have a clinician who's mobile, and he or she has an armed guard with her in the shape of a police officer. So Netcare started trying to divert those resources to do what Netcare wanted to do. And that was not there was some funding that came because of this program, and the funding being provided to Netcare was not for that purpose. Let's put it that way. And then down here is some more from McGeorge. He said, this is a COP function with assistance from a mental health viewpoint. This is not a clinical mental health function. Safety has to be established at the scene before we can help people, and a lot of people forget that. I think that's a really important paragraph, and I want to read that again. This is a COP function with assistance from a mental health viewpoint. This is not a clinical mental health function. Safety has to be established at the scene by police before we can help people, and a lot of people forget that. So I think that's important because this is an actual clinician, someone with a he has to have at least a master's degree, right? And a license to provide these kind of services. And he's reiterating the fact that this is a police function, that responding to 911 calls, this is a police function. This is what police do. And the clinician is there to provide assistance to the police. But it's not a situation where they're replacing the police or that they're going to do what people thought the police were there to do. This is more of a support service. This is kind of like, it might be a bad analogy, but having a clinician along for a mental health crisis call is not that different than airing for a canine if I have a suspect running. The canine is not there to make the arrest and do all the paperwork and everything for me. The canine is there to assist me. Sometimes just the dog on scene barking is enough. And I don't want to get too far into it, but they don't even let the dogs loose very often anymore. A lot of times they'll have the dog on a leash and we'll kind of track somebody and they'll never let the dog off, and we'll go apprehend that person, because the responding patrol officer is still the most important part of this puzzle. And that's one thing that people don't understand. So at the end of the day, I just wanted to go over this story and let you know, or at least show you the perspective from at least one mental health professional. And if you believe what he's saying, which I do, there's a lot of people who feel the same way he does, and they're leaving the mental health organization to come work with the police officers because they value what the police officers do. And this whole reformer aspect or activist aspect that came from the mental health side, the people who actually work in the field and work with the police officers, they viewed that as a toxic trait. So when you hear police officers and different people talking about, or they're not completely sold on the whole idea of social workers replacing police officers, it's because they actually understand how this stuff works. And the people who are kind of saying something different, they just don't understand how things work. And if they want the people who need these services to get the service that they need, those activists need to get out of the way and let the people who actually know what they're doing do their job. And that's kind of a theme for a lot of my thoughts. So anyway, thanks for watching. I'll talk to you guys soon.